held at this year's Herzberg Lecture. Now, the Herzberg Lecture is held during the fall term every year, and it's named in honor of Dr. Gerhard Herzberg. Dr. Herzberg was born in Germany. He moved to Canada in 1935 to teach and conduct physics research at the University of Saskatchewan. In 1945, he moved to the University of Chicago and taught for several years there and conducted his research there before moving back to Canada to take up a position with the National Research Council here in Ottawa. Now, Dr. Herzberg was widely recognized for his work in the field of atomic and molecular spectroscopy. And in fact, in 1971, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for that work. He has a significant connection to Carleton. He was the chancellor from 1973 to 1980. And as many of you either know or may have noticed, there's one of the main buildings for the science faculty on campus is named after him and houses many of the departments here on campus. Now, throughout his career, Dr. Herzberg was dedicated to furthering freedom of inquiry in science, a strong proponent of the important and relevant role that science had for society. And so a lecture series like this, named in his honor, exploring a science-related topic of general interest, seemed a very fitting tribute. And these lectures have now been running for many years in his memory. Now tonight we're very fortunate to have Dr. Rick Holley from the University of Manitoba to speak to us on the subject of food irradiation. After Dr. Holley's lecture, we'll open up the floor to questions, and also after the questions are done, we'll have a reception out in the foyer, and we're very pleased if you can join us for that afterwards for some more follow-up conversation around the talk. But as we move into the main phase of the talk now, if I could ask you to please turn off cell phones and any other electronic devices for the remainder of the talk, and we'll now begin the more specific part of the evening. So, to introduce Dr. Holley, we're very pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Ron Deering. He's currently a counsel with the Gowlings law firm, but is very well versed in many aspects of food and agricultural law through his work at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and Agriculture Canada. And so, Dr. Deering, I'd like to ask you to come forward and introduce the speaker.
It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Rick Holley, my friend. He's the distinguished research scientist at the University of Manitoba. Rick has done all the usual academic things. He's published more than 140 academic papers, but he's also been quite unique in that he descends from the ivory tower to actually do CBC radio interviews and makes an effort to do risk communication to a generally illiterate public, which is I've tried to do in the past, and that's quite intimidating, Rick. So you've also served in a number of advisory committees, including with my old organization, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So it's a real honor to be here today to introduce you. Just before you begin, I need to make a small warning. My whole food science and nutrition class is here tonight. One of their topics was food irradiation. So we have 20 experts on food irradiation here. So I want you to know that not be too intimidated by this, but I also want you to know that, of course, they're also going to be marking you. Anyway, it's with a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rick Holley. Rick.
Thank you very much, Ron. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to participate in this Herzberg Lecture. Great honor for me. And it's also a pleasure to come to Carleton and hopefully support the food science program. That's a fledgling program that has some pretty avid leadership, and so I would encourage your continued enthusiasm for the subject and press those kids, certainly the 20 that have more knowledge of irradiation than I do, to learn more. Yes, and so the subject I've been asked to address is the safety of food, and the interpretation that I put on that is to take a look at whether or not food irradiation, excuse me, I am going to take this off. whether or not food irradiation is likely to be of any significant value to us, because of course in the bigger picture, food irradiation has been around for quite a few years, and in fact, one of the very first countries in which the irradiation of food was approved was right here in Canada, 1965, the irradiation of potatoes. And we do have some approvals for irradiation of food in this country, but absolutely nothing has happened in terms of further development of the use of food irradiation since that time in Canada. And we wonder perhaps why that might be. We don't have full answers, but it was somewhat telling recently that, that Health Canada admitted that it was public, I guess, more than complacency, objection, really, and suspicion that really brought the thing to a halt, because there was a legislative initiative that went halfway back in that year and never saw the light of day. More about that later. So, there certainly are a lot of different types of processing procedures that can be brought to address issues associated with generating safe food. Do we really need to have another one? And could it possibly be that the use of food irradiation might actually hide some shoddy practices on the part of the food industry? And I think that that's an issue in the back of all of our minds. And I'll attempt to try and address some of those features of this issue associated with irradiation of food. But back to the question of, must we irradiate food? And so I show you this picture and just read what it says. All recalled raw beef products have been removed from our shelves. The XL meat recall, the largest recall of fresh beef in Canada, because of E. coli 0157H7. We don't know how to get E. coli 0157H7 out of meat. And just maybe this is a way in which this can happen in a dependable and predictable fashion. In the presentation I want to continue with, these are the subjects that I'll address. We have some vulnerabilities in this country that include foodborne illness, foodborne illness surveillance. We don't do a very good job of that at all. There are some incredible limitations in terms of the resource that has been devoted to foodborne illness surveillance. There are limitations associated with the inspection exercise that takes place in Canada that leave an incredible amount to be desired, even though we have some pretty conscientious and knowledgeable people that are involved in the business of food inspection. I want to talk about a few of those limitations today. A few words about the foods that cause foodborne illness and the bacteria that are responsible for those. We really don't know very much about either of these things in a way that inspires a great deal of confidence. And what really is bothersome is that if the surveillance systems that monitored foodborne illness were able to identify and separate the various types of food that were largely responsible for foodborne illness, identify the bacteria that most frequently are responsible for causing foodborne illness, then we might be able to put together a plan in a priority sense to address those elements, those organisms in specific foods that are causing the biggest problems one by one and attack them in a specific, ordered, and strategic way so that we would be able to use the limited resources that we have to have the biggest bang for the buck. We don't do that in Canada. You can't tell me whether or not chicken wings or ice cream cause more cases of foodborne illness. Which one of the two does? We don't know that in Canada. Surprise, surprise. Why don't we? Why can't we? We ought to, because anything that we do is stopgap. Unless we have that information, we can't act strategically. We need to prevent the problems from happening. And how do we do that? Well, we have to identify what those problems are first. Same problems that happen in the United States don't necessarily hold true for Canada. And the only way we can formulate food safety policy in Canada right now, because the data on that subject are so bad, is to use American data. Well, guess what? They eat different stuff than we do, and they cook it differently too. They eat different stuff in British Columbia than they do in Newfoundland. My wife, Carol, she's here tonight. We went to Newfoundland last year, and boy, do they eat different stuff there than they do in Winnipeg. Some of it's pretty good too. There's developments in agriculture that have taken place over the last 20 years that significantly influence the types of organisms that dominate and cause foodborne illness problems. They're related to the integration of agriculture, how agriculture is done, intensive farming, vertically integrated farming. We have produce that's produced in very large acreages that's harvested all at the same time and sold over large geographic areas. And of course, what all of that means is greater opportunity for a small focus of pathogenic bacteria to affect larger quantities of food via contamination routes of different types. And because it's distributed to more people, affect more people. And so the statistics show us that each year goes by, we're seeing large outbreaks caused by food vehicles that we never really thought were very important in the past. And so there's a dynamic there, but there's also a dynamic when you take a close look at some of the organisms. There's a dynamic there too. There's different organisms cause most cases of foodborne illness today than did 30 years ago. An older colleague of mine, just retired, built a large portion of his food microbiology course around Bacillus cereus and Staphylococcus aureus foodborne illnesses. They're a very minor component of foodborne illnesses today. Today we know about Listeria monocytogenes, we know about E. coli 0157H7 and a few of its relatives that we don't even know how to detect in food yet. So all of that has to be taken into consideration in building a strategy to address these issues. Pathogen recycling. We do a lot of work in agriculture attempting to find ways in which we can reduce the frequency with which E. coli 0157H7 is shed by cattle. The organism gets into cattle, causes us to become sick, but a whole bunch of these zoonotic pathogens are resident in animals and don't make them sick, but they're distributed by the animals. The animals are little factories, and they poop these organisms all over, everywhere. The other animals walk through it, put it on their hide, and transfer it to vegetable material. So we're seeing produce causing far, far greater numbers of foodborne illness than ever before. 25 years ago, 1% of foodborne illness cases were caused by contaminated produce. Today, 25% of foodborne illness cases are caused by contaminated produce. Where's it coming from? We do a lot of work, as I said, studying shedding of E. coli 015787 by cattle. We could shoot them with vaccines, and we give them hay or straw, and we change their diets, and we claim a victory whenever we see that instead of shedding E. coli for 60 days, they shed E. coli for 10 days. Ah, we have the solution. The cattle are only shedding E. coli for 10 days. But what we don't look at is the fact that 20% of the animal feed that we're using is contaminated with E. coli 015787. It's not even taken into consideration when you take a look at how some of these scientific studies are conducted. We had a visitor in Manitoba from Texas A&M, animal science guy, talking about E. coli shedding. And they were doing this and they were doing that. And yeah, there's this small victory and that small victory. And I asked him in the lecture at the end, I was very pleasant, and I asked him, I said, you know, was the animal feed that you used contaminated or checked to see if it did not contain E. coli 015787 when you did those studies? Oh yes, was the answer. He came up to me after everybody else had left and he said, you know what? I don't think we did. And there's a lot of other studies where that's done too. What we're doing is those pathogenic organisms from the cattle, the sheep, and the hogs are going into the manure, onto the fields. The plants are harvested, fed to us, and the rest is fed back to the animals. And so there's a continuous cycle that we need to break. We need to separate plant agriculture from animal agriculture better in order to have any hope in the future that we can control the contamination by these animals with Salmonella and E. coli 015787. Mad cow and canola is up there because the situation is getting worse. As a result of mad cow, ruminant protein, protein from cows, ground up cows were used to feed other cows, the protein ingredient in their diets after thermal treatment. But with mad cow, that was a prohibition put on this, but there was still there was a deficiency in the amount of protein we had to, in the diets, we had to access that protein somewhere else. So we accessed it from oil seeds. Guess what? The canola meal and the soybean meal are almost uniformly contaminated, certainly at levels of 20%, 80% sometimes. That also is now enhancing the recycling, the buildup of contamination in the environment that these animals live in. And I don't see an easy solution to that one because industry is just not interested in taking those organisms out of animal feed. It's not cost effective from their perspective. The animals don't get sick. Why should they react? I mean, if it was mad cow or foot and mouth disease or avian flu, avian influenza, you'd be damn sure that something would be done about it. But this is Salmonella. It doesn't make the animals sick. So what do? We say E. coli 015787 in ground beef is an adulterant. We prohibit it. We don't prevent it from being there. We prohibit it. We draw a regulation. Ron, you'd like that. Let's make a rule. It can't be there. But we don't do anything about preventing it from being there in an intelligent fashion, in an intelligent way. And we need to think about that a little more intelligently. So irradiation, in my view, does have a place in the future. Because if we don't have the motivation to reduce agricultural input contamination, using conventional means. Yes, we know how we can prevent carcasses from carrying E. coli 015787, and prevention is the key here. If it's not on the carcasses, it's not in the ground beef. Don't tell me you can test it out, because you can't test it out. You can test a bit of it, and if it's positive, then yes, it's in that bit, but you don't know if it's in the rest. Statistically, it doesn't work. You test 65 grams in a tote. However big the tote is depends on the plant, right? Every lot is tested for E. coli 015787. By the way, only in federal plants. Yeah, E. coli 015787 is an adulterant in ground meat that's made in a federally registered plant in Canada, not in a provincially registered plant in Canada. Is there two standards? Yeah, maybe. But if you test the provincial meat and you find E. coli 015787, you've got to hold it. So guess what? We just don't test it. Problem solved. Listeria on produce? Yeah, it's there. Zero tolerance for listeria in the United States in federally registered plants. The FDA, different attitude. I don't agree with zero tolerance. This is not the solution. We've got, if we go forward with zero tolerance for pathogens in raw food, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to end up testing and testing and testing and spending more money on testing. We're going to spend more money wasting food that does have pathogens in it. We're not going to have enough left to eat. We have to prevent the organisms from being there, and the legislation that we will have zero tolerance is not a mature approach. We don't have it in Canada, only at federally registered meat plants, so that we can sell that meat to the Americans, because they do have it. Anyway, I got to go on or I won't finish. I submit to you that foodborne illness is not a minor problem in this country. These are the figures from Health Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada. And we do have some folks here from the Public Health Agency of Canada who can vouch for the fact that these are correct. They're not particularly accurate, but they are correct. How many people die each year? We don't know. Maybe 600 by my guess. Nobody's really keeping track. And Industry Canada figures is about 15. So the whole area is grossly underdocumented and underreported. Foodborne illness in Canada is underreported by 1 in 85 to 1 in 500. But the data do speak to the issue that this is an area that's second only to diabetes in terms of what it costs us, in terms of economic burden and in terms of discomfort and loss of quality of life. Because some of the people who get ill not only die, but have chronic illnesses that last the rest of their lives. It's just a little bit more complex than foodborne illness caused by Staphylococcus aureus and Clostridium perfringens and Bacillus cereus, where you get over the illness before you know you even had it. Although there's a period of time in there when you wish you died. But other types of illness like Campylobacter-caused illness can certainly lead to long-term chronic effects that are pretty serious. Guillain-Barré disease, or illness syndrome rather, can lead to partial, temporary, or complete quadriplegia for at least a year, and there's several thousand cases of this in the United States each year. So most of the organisms that cause foodborne illness are resident in animals. That includes Campylobacter, #1 cause of gastroenteritis in Canada, Salmonella, and E. coli 015787, not Shigella, that's waterborne illness. But those are the organisms of greater concern in terms of foodborne illness in Canada. While a larger percentage of the illnesses are caused by viruses, a greater percentage of mortality is caused by these bacteria. And so the point is that because they don't cause clinical illness most of the time in the animals that they are resident in, the motivation is there not to get them out. And so this is a chronic problem that we have faced since we really understood this whole issue for some time. And the motivation to make a change just is not there. And so we can expect to find more foodborne illness cases caused by produce in the near future as a result of this. A few words about the Canadian food safety system. There certainly are some significant issues. I've already mentioned foodborne illness surveillance. A system that we use in Canada is grossly reactive. We have 2 national systems for recording cases of foodborne illness, but the data that they generate is grossly incomplete. From this perspective, from the clinical side of things, the National Notifiable Infectious Disease Reporting System sounds very official, right? It's voluntary. It's voluntary. The hospitals in the provinces collect this information and they report it to the Provincial Health Agency. The Provincial Health Agency may report it to the Public Health Agency of Canada or not. And when they do, the quality of the data is very poor. They may report one incident involving 20 people as one isolation. So it's real hard to get at the crux of the data. On the analytical side, we have the National Enteric Surveillance Reporting System out of Winnipeg Lab. And it will do the analysis and identify the genomic sequence of Listeria monocytogenes in a foodborne illness outbreak. And every time it isolates and identifies an organism, it puts a tick mark 1. And they'll do it for other organisms as well. Really efficient. Number of cases they deal with each year. Last year that they reported, 2011, 4,000. How many cases of foodborne illness occur in Canada every year according to PHAC estimates? At 13 million cases, that's 64,000 cases each and every day of the week. Their cumulative yearly data represent 4,000 reports for the year 2000. The data for Campylobacter coming from the provinces on the clinical side are 3 whole years out of date. How in God's name can you use data from foodborne illness that's 3 years old in order to develop a strategy to address foodborne illness? Anybody here tell me? Well, the answer is simple. You're not paying attention, ladies and gentlemen. We use American data. We have a 2-tiered inspection system in Canada. We have the federal and we have the provincial. I told you about E. coli 015787. It's an adulterant in the federal plants and it's not in the provincial plants. That's just an example and it goes on beyond that. And we have 3 levels of government that are involved in the whole gamish. We have the feds, we have the provincial governments, departments of agriculture, usually, sometimes departments of health. And then we have municipal governments who won't accept the training of any of the others for their inspectors. They're responsible for restaurants, food service. Okay, so we have food production and we have food service. And then we have airports. Who owns the airports in Canada? They're federal, right? Health Canada is the responsibility for inspecting restaurants at airports in Canada. Or they used to. They decided they're not going to do that anymore. You know how many people go through Pearson Airport every year? 17 million. Sorry, 34 million. Vancouver, 17 million. How many people live in Canada? 33 million. Hey, every time you go to the airport, do you eat something or not? It's inspected ad hoc. Inspection can't save us, though. Hey, you look. It's nice to have inspection. That just keeps people honest. It's the industry that's responsible to build safety into the food that they're handling. It's industry's responsibility. Don't for a moment get caught in thinking that the CFIA is going to protect you from contaminated food. You can take a look at recall data, epidemiology during a foodborne illness outbreak. And there's 6 or 7 that I've got. Historical records involved in Canada and the United States where very clearly recalls were not announced until the peak of the foodborne illness event was on the downswing. Months, absolutely months after those foodborne illnesses began. Recalls are okay before people get sick. That's where recalls work. They're part of the normal hazard analysis critical control point programs that should be put in place to prevent problems from happening. But when they occur after to get food out of the marketplace, this is not right. This is an excuse. It's not. Recall and traceability are things that governments key on to tell you and I that they're doing something meaningful about preventing foodborne illness. Crap. It isn't true. It's an excuse. The control comes right at the beginning, where the food is likely to be contaminated. Prevent it from happening. That's where we have to put our resources. And that's where irradiation comes in. And then, of course, there's the issue of the relationship between food regulatory folks, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the agriculture departments across the country, and the public health people. They get along just fine at meetings like this. But ask them to share data. Totally different story. Privacy of information. Patient statistics. All get in the way. Constitutional restrictions. There is delegated responsibility for food safety from the Public Health Agency of Canada through to the provinces. I mean, all you have to do is look in your wallets. Do you have a federal health card or a provincial health card in your wallet? Health is a provincial mandate. So where does the Canadian Food Inspection Agency fit into all of this? That's federal. Can you see the problem? So they got to work better together under stress. Yes, they have memoranda of understanding that are supposed to supervene all of these issues, but they never work under pressure. What I'm creating here, I hope, is perhaps an appreciation for the complexity of the food safety system in Canada at an organizational level, and also characteristics of the way in which pathogens move through food in order to allow you to recognize that we need to think about these issues associated with food contamination in a way where we have the capacity to exert some control. And right now, we don't have the capacity to exert the kind of control that we need to exert in order to have assurance that the next time we go to a restaurant and order a meal, the carrots aren't going to cause us to have listeriosis. So, American data. Because American data are probably more comprehensive than in most other countries, I share these with you today. This is a history of frequencies of foodborne illness caused by some 8 different organisms since the FoodNet program was started in the United States. This is a program, a sentinel site program. We have a fledgling sentinel site program in Canada called C-Internet. It operates in 2 sites, Kitchener-Waterloo and in Burnaby area in BC. It monitors the health of 1 million people, and you use that as an index of what's happening in a larger sense. In Canada, we want to develop 5, but it's only at 2 because Health Canada doesn't have the money to create the other 3 yet. In the United States, they have 10 sites, and they monitor the health of 46 million Americans. You know, we chide the Americans for having such great debt, but at least they're spending some of that debt in a way in which they can generate useful information in order to make a plan as to what to do in the future about foodborne illnesses. And so what they see is that here, this is 1, no change in frequencies of foodborne illness over a period of time from when this program was started in 1996, 1998, through to last year, 2011. And so this would represent no change running right straight across here. And so there's been a slight decrease in most of these pathogens that are of some concern to us, like Salmonella here and E. coli. And I think this is Listeria. No, it's not. Campylobacter, #1 cause of foodborne illness, gastroenteritis in Canada. No change. Look, what this is saying is whatever the hell they're doing in that country, it isn't making a big pile of difference. Except Vibrio up at the top in brown. That's because people, it's much more popular to eat raw shellfish now than it was 20 years ago. And that's the price you pay. That's a deadly organism too. We don't have it in Canada because we're not close enough to the shellfish harvesting areas. Raw fish. Well, how do you solve that problem? Vibrio, make 0 tolerance for Vibrio in oysters. That'll solve the problem. I'm glad you're with me. I see some smiles. I didn't hear anything. We need to do something else. This is what this tells us. We need to do something else. So, we don't have a lot of data in Canada, but here's some. Nobody in Canada is charged with keeping statistics on foodborne illness outbreaks, but when retroactive surveys are done by Public Health Agency of Canada, what they find is there's about 226 foodborne illness outbreaks in this country every year. 226 every year. All right? That's about the same number of food recalls as there are. And I'll get it. No, I really did lose that piece of that train of thought. At the Public Health Agency of Canada, I think the Microbial Hazards Bureau should really keep track of these data, but they don't keep track of the data. Could you imagine that nobody is charged with a historical record of foodborne illness outbreaks in Canada? I know what I was going to say. 75% of these foodborne illness outbreaks involve 10 people or less. But 10% involve 75 people or more. So you can see that, and only 10% of foodborne illness occurs in outbreaks. What this means is that 90% of illnesses don't occur as part of visible outbreaks, but rather sporadic events that might involve 10 or 12 people. Usually chicken and usually salmonella. All that stuff gets lost, never finds its way into the record. If it did, then we would have a database which would be much more robust and provide the fuel that's necessary in order to put programs in place that were meaningful and address the issues associated with food safety. So These are the documented cases. And one of the things to look at here are the change, a relative proportion of illness outbreaks that are caused by meat, poultry, and fish, which traditionally are much more risky, where we've directed more of our attention when it comes to foodborne illness than ever before, and produce. Remember the E. coli shedding by the cattle and the manure being put on the produce? We don't have a solution for that. Most cattle farms, whether they're organic, whether they're small, whether they're large and integrated, will have cattle at one time or another during the year that are positive for E. coli 0157H7. Organic and local can't protect us here, ladies and gentlemen. It can't. And don't you listen to the individual farmer that raises organic beef telling you that I'm full of you know what. Because there's no science behind that comment. The data very clearly show that 35% of farms in the United States have at one time or another during the course of the year animals there that shed E. coli 0157H7. Bigger picture, notorious foodborne illness outbreaks. On this one, 50% of these foodborne illness outbreaks involve produce. Unheard of a few years ago. Where are we going with it? Right now, there's a food recall involving hazelnuts and hazelnut and almond mixture distributed through Loblaws right straight across this country that are contaminated with salmonella. But of course, the CFIA says nobody's ill yet. That wasn't the case. I don't know if it's here. It was on the previous slide. Amira walnuts last year in Montreal killed one person because of salmonella. We'll see it on nuts more and more often. In fact, in the United States now, federally registered plants that are processing almonds have to pasteurize the almonds. But you can't do that with hazelnuts because the oil won't stand the pasteurization temperatures. It's too highly unsaturated. What do you do with them? You have to throw them out. Or you feed them to the pigs because the pigs aren't going to get sick. What do you think? What do you think happened to all of the Spanish cucumbers that were originally implicated in that foodborne illness outbreak? You go on the internet and you'll see those damn vegetables were fed to the goats. If they had been contaminated with a pathogenic organism, that's exactly where they would have gone. But it turned out it was the fenugreek seeds, after all. Organic and locally grown. Shame on me. In the United States, they have targets for foodborne illness. We don't. We don't have targets for foodborne illness, thresholds beyond which we consider that we're not doing enough to prevent foodborne illness. They have national health objectives. Now, there's a lot of data on this slide, and my pointer's in my jacket, and I'll just use my finger. 2010, these were the averages of those 10 sentinel sites. I've just chosen 4 states here, and I was making a different point with this slide when I first made it up. But you can see that the national health objective for Campylobacter and Salmonella was not achieved in 2010. So what did the Americans do? They put in new requirements for levels of carcass contamination of poultry relative to Campylobacter and Salmonella. And at the same time, they reduced the requirement. They lowered the bar. They're not stupid, those Americans. So instead of having a requirement for a less than 12.3 cases per 100,000 individual, in 2020, the target's been reduced to 8.5. So it'll look like they're doing better. And the same is true for Salmonella. But at least they have targets. And what that allows you to say is that the interventions we've put in place do or do not work. Have the new regulations regarding permissible levels of carcass contamination of poultry by Campylobacter and Salmonella had an effect on reducing the number of cases of foodborne illness caused by these organisms? The survey data will tell you this, if the survey data is any good. We don't do that in Canada. My God. That'd be science. We need to develop some corrections in illness surveillance, food inspection, moving it from superficial to much more integrated and insightful. We need to get the food and public health agencies working better together in terms of sharing data. But even with those things, there is vulnerability remaining associated with pathogen recycling. We need to stop or address issues associated with animal feed contamination, a complex issue. The industry will call me a heretic and a loose cannon, but I really think that this is where the problem begins. And we have to separate animal agriculture from plant agriculture. We can disinfect animal feed. It will have absolutely no effect on the outcome if the farms are still contaminated, if the cats are carrying the organism, if the rats are carrying the organism, if the birds are pooping salmonella all over the feed. It will have absolutely no effect whatsoever. We have to coordinate a cleanup of the farms to get the organisms out of the farms and then stop putting it in the animals. Do it in an intelligent way. Until such time as we do that, we are going to continue to have a problem. And if there is still reluctance on the part of industry and agriculture to address this issue in a mature fashion, the only solution we have is to pasteurize using irradiation. And my targets for this would be poultry and secondly, ground beef. These are the things that we need to be careful of in terms of issues related to zoonotic pathogens and their control. If we don't have safe water, give up and go home or move to another country. If we mess up in the kitchen, out of luck. We can control listeria problems because the listeria lives, it's ubiquitous. It is the only organism that I've talked about tonight or that you will find in the food safety literature that is ubiquitous in the environment. The other ones are not. A lot of people will lead you to believe that Salmonella and Campylobacter are ubiquitous in the environment. They're not. You can raise these animals without these organisms being there. And that's my point. We don't care to, because it's too expensive. We need to control pathogen accumulation in the animal population, specifically those two organisms to begin with. And we need to take a very serious look at controlling pathogens, E. coli and Salmonella specifically, in poultry by using irradiation. If we did that, if we used irradiation to pasteurize poultry to eliminate Campylobacter and Salmonella, some E. coli, we would reduce the frequency of foodborne illness in this country tomorrow, the day after we did it, by 25%. Is that enough motivation? What else do I need to do to convince you? What is food irradiation? A lot of you are, at least 20 of you know more than's on this slide. Irradiation can be used from several sources, but has the capacity to kill bacteria by disrupting DNA and causing lethality. Some organisms are resistant. You can elevate the dose to levels that are sufficient to kill everything. You wouldn't want to eat the food after that, but at levels that are permissible for use in food it works. And it kills the pathogens, and it doesn't always kill all of the spoilage bacteria, so perishable food products still need to be refrigerated after treatment using irradiation. The food will not glow in the dark because the energy levels that are permissible, somewhere between 5 and 10 mega electron volts, is not sufficient to cause the food to become radioactive. It doesn't work in all situations. It certainly is being used widely now to prevent insect infestation in foods, in vegetable products that are transmitted from, that are sold in international commerce. These are the foods in the US that are approved for irradiation and the doses. The Americans have just upped the dose permissible for poultry irradiation to 7 kilogray in late November, and they also approved that it can be packaged in non-barrier packaging materials, which I thought was two important changes in Canada. But nothing has happened in Canada. The approvals that are there have been there for 25 years. Health Canada and the CFIA have policy that's on their website indicating they will accept submissions from industry and expedite their approval should they be suitable, and that's where it sits. The Canadian Beef Cattlemen's Association is in the process of developing a petition to ask for permission to allow ground beef to be irradiated in Canada. But basically, at the moment, there is no permission for that in Canada. In the United States, there's about 30,000 tons of ground beef which is irradiated. But otherwise, irradiation is only used for spice sterilization, and that approval does exist in Canada, and it is used for that purpose in this country as well. I see opportunity for the use of irradiation to improve safety of food in this country and cover off a vulnerability that in the short term is not going to be addressed by anything remotely satisfactory that's likely to take place in Canada. Certainly during my lifetime, I will not see it. In order to achieve safe food, we have to systematically address the greatest risks. And those risks right now, as far as I can see, are from Salmonella and Campylobacter. And certainly proclaiming that raw foods that contain these organisms are adulterated is not a suitable solution. If you take a look at what's happening in the United States, in June of this year, they just gave birth to a new regulation that declares 6 other serotypes of toxigenic E. coli adulterant status in ground beef. And by the way, while these organisms have adulterant status in ground beef, the irony is that on the intact carcasses, they're not adulterants. So the law is really unusual and not consistent with logic in any vocabulary that I'm familiar with, Ron. I don't get it. However, I'm not a beef manufacturer and I don't sell to the United States. Maybe I'd feel differently if I were a farmer. But I expect that my food is going to be safe to eat, you know. Just cook your beef. That's all you have to do. And all the cook the poultry. And then everything I said is just crap. But we know that educational programs have not been able to address issues associated with mistakes that are sometimes made at homes. The most common setting for foodborne illness to occur, we're not sure, depending on who you read, it might be food service or it might be the home. I think it's the home. I think food service is overrated. But it's certainly an issue of education, training, and proper food handling. No question that plays an important role here. But we know this too for a fact, that if you put contaminated raw food into a kitchen, it's going to lead to foodborne illnesses. A direct correlation. Cross-contamination at some point in time is going to happen. So industry has to bear some kind of responsibility for putting contaminated food into my kitchen. We have to be sure that the food safety programs that we put in place, they have to be correct. They have to be good programs. They have to prevent problems from happening, really address the proper issues, and that the inspection oversight is adequate to address the problems where they are, and not just the cosmetic issues associated with the problems, so that we can prevent problems from happening. These programs have to be proactive. And we certainly need education and training at all levels to ensure that people truly understand and recognize when they make a mistake and what the impact of that error might be in terms of overall safety of the food that we eat. So it's more than just doing things right. We have to do the right things. We have to know what those things are we need to do, and then do them right. That Weatherill report after the listeriosis outbreak was really crafted to see who was doing the wrong stuff and point fingers. Never really addressed the issue of whether or not the things that were being done were in fact the right things to do in the first place. And that's the crime. And that's unfortunate. But that's what we wanted to hear. We wanted to hear who screwed up. So, that brings me to an end of my talk with you this evening, and certainly this is what it's all directed toward: safe food. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thanks from all of us, Rick. That was a really interesting, provocative. We have a talk. We have an opportunity to have some questions of Rick in a little bit here. Can you hear me? I don't think my thing's working. I'll just talk loud. So, any questions for Rick here? This gentleman does. Shout it out. Oh, I see. Oh, yes. There's a mic right here. Yes, good.
Good evening, Rick.
Good evening, Alex.
Bit of a
Be nice, okay?
Oh, I just thought I'd toss out. Tell us a good question. I'm sure something you'd enjoy talking about. The practice of mechanical tenderization of beef and pork, perhaps, and how this affects the safety of the product.
Yes. This goes back to the issue of the status of E. coli 0157 or other toxigenic E. coli as adulterants in ground beef, but not in whole carcasses. And the reason in part for that dichotomy in the regulation in the American vocabulary is that when the organisms are on the surface of the meat, the opportunity for exposure to higher temperatures during cooking is much greater when they're on the surface. When you take that meat and you grind it all up, the organisms are internalized. And so if you don't cook your beef to an internal temperature of 71 degrees Celsius, you're not likely to kill the E. coli on the inside. And so the regulation in the United States regarding E. coli as an adulterant not only includes ground beef, but it includes a category that's called non-intact beef. So the intact beef would be the individual slice that's unadulterated. But industry has a practice of mechanical tenderization. This is where they would take knives or needles and stab the meat. And you can go to the kitchen store and you can buy a mechanical tenderizer that you operate by hand, and you can just jab the meat and mechanically tenderize it. And on cheap cuts that normally would not be grilling steaks, you can grill them after you've done this. You break up the connective tissue. But if the E. coli is on the surface, these needle points will push the E. coli inside. We know that. We've done the work, and a lot of other people have done it too. So this outbreak of foodborne illness from the XL meat just a few months ago in Canada also involved at least one family where several members ate steak that was bought at Costco, and that steak was mechanically tenderized. And so the issue of increased risk associated with internal contamination of the meat by toxigenic E. coli by mechanical tenderization is an issue that has some basis in fact. And the risk is increased in mechanically tenderized beef where the surface has sufficient contamination by these organisms. But in general, the level of E. coli 015787 on the surface of carcasses is at a level that's so low, the probability that the E. coli are going to be internalized is not as large as you might think. And so when you do an assessment of risk based on the frequencies with which these carcasses are actually contaminated, numbers of organisms per square centimeter, and those numbers are less than one organism per square centimeter, the overall added risk is no more than something like a factor of 2. So there is the increased risk, but it's not at a level or magnitude that you would think it would be in the mechanical tenderized beef over the intact beef. So it's there. Yeah.
Given the mortality involved in listeriosis outbreaks, and notably here in 2008, and the fact that prepared meats are quite often not cooked, I was somewhat surprised that you didn't have that as a priority, and I was just wondering if you could comment on it.
Yes, absolutely. I think in the case of processed meat products that we don't really need to irradiate them. We have the wherewithal to achieve the necessary control there, and I think in that case irradiation's not needed. And if it ain't needed, let's not use it where it ain't needed. We've got programs in place that will lead to almost zero contamination of Listeria monocytogenes of processed meat products, packaged sliced processed meat products. Those programs are in place, and they include ingredients like sodium lactate and sodium diacetate as chemical ingredients that inhibit the growth of this organism. So it won't grow in products that contain regulated amounts of those two chemicals, plus nitrite and salt, at levels that are also approved. With sanitation, you're not going to get the kind of cross-contamination that occurred in that maple leaf plant. They very clearly admitted that the programs they had in place failed. And that's how this outbreak occurred. They weren't cleaning the machine properly, and then you had foci of infection. So I think we know how. We have the resource. We have the technology. All we have to do is apply it properly, and that's not going to happen again. We don't need irradiation there. With poultry, we don't know what to do about Campylobacter because we don't understand the organism. We don't know how to get it out of the flocks. We don't know really where it's coming from. It's so damned hard to grow. And I think that's really the biggest bang for our buck. The salmon, most poultry, by the way, if I didn't say this, most poultry is contaminated with Campylobacter. Most poultry. I'll give you a figure of 80%, but I'll bet it's higher than that, and it's 100% in Newfoundland. It likes the East Coast. 40% is contaminated with salmonella. Now, come on. You either stop feeding these animals salmonella, and we just did some work in our lab for the CBC.
Well, there's a not biased.
Yeah. Well, we analyzed pet food last year for them, and you know what? We never found any salmonella in the pet food. So they didn't go with the story. And I mean, I was honest. I mean, if it wasn't there, it's not there. You know, they were disappointed. But you should have seen their eyes when we came up with 4 out of 12 positive salmonella on poultry feed. Oh my God. They emailed me twice today.
Other questions, folks? Yeah, there's this lady's got one. Yeah.
Thank you for an enjoyable talk. I found it very interesting. My question, I understand that it's common practice to feed cattle and other livestock low-grade antibiotics. And I'm just wondering, what's the purpose of feeding antibiotics at a low grade in general? And does that have an effect on the amount of bacteria that are found within the cattle? And then is that in some way contributing to, you know, a higher virulence of bacteria that we're seeing?
Yeah, three nice questions. Why do we feed animals subtherapeutic levels of antibiotics? Subtherapeutic, of course, being below a level which will cause inhibition of pathogenic organisms. Why would we do that? Well, we do it because it increases animal productivity by a factor of at least 10%. It has effects in the gut of the animal that select for organisms that are less competitive for nutrients, we believe, than if they weren't there, and allow the host animal to use those nutrients to grow better. And that's a universal fact. This use of antibiotics, very clearly in my mind, not in the minds of Canadian or American regulators, but certainly in the minds of European regulators, has contributed to the overall burden of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The more you put antibiotics in front of bacteria, the more frequently you're going to see organisms develop antibiotic resistances, particularly if the antibiotics are present at levels that don't kill the bacteria. That's a natural bacterial response. Now, antibiotic resistance genes in bacteria are not new and predate the use of antibiotics from a human perspective. Antibiotics exist in the environment naturally. They're produced by other microorganisms. We've taken advantage of this and made our own for our own purposes. We've only used them for 55 years. But there was a study out of McMaster that was published last year where these folks went up into the Yukon and they did drill cores in permafrost. And they went down, carbon dated, they went down 30,000 years. Okay, and they pulled up these cores. And they isolated DNA from bacteria. They were able to identify there was bacterial DNA. And that bacterial DNA had genes that were responsible for resistance to penicillin, vancomycin, and tetracycline 30,000 years ago. So these genes have existed. What we're doing when we're using antibiotics as growth promotants is providing an enhanced opportunity for these organisms to flourish. Does it create bacteria that have greater virulence? It can. There's evidence that this can happen, particularly with Campylobacter. Fluoroquinolines were approved for use in Japan and were used in the United States in 1995 and shortly withdrawn thereafter, because one of the other nasty features about Campylobacter is its ability to acquire antibiotic resistances and spread them around. And it's resistant to fluoroquinolines very, very easily. And fluoroquinoline resistance developed as the result of the use of fluoroquinoline in poultry diets. Fluoroquinolines are a drug of primary use in the treatment of E. coli and Salmonella infections, where not all E. coli 0157 infections are antibiotics indicated, but where they are indicated, they have great use, and so that compromised that use. So fluoroquinolines were withdrawn for use in poultry feed in Japan and the United States for that reason. And so that is a vulnerability. The data that are being considered in the decision by the Canadian regulatory, in the case of Canada, of course, it's the Canadian Food Inspection Agency taking direction from Health Canada, and in the United States is there's not enough solid scientific evidence to support a ban on the use of antibiotics as growth promotants in Canada at the present time. But I think the handwriting is on the wall, and it will come. I mean, after all, this is common sense, ladies and gentlemen.
We have time for a couple more questions. Go ahead, please.
Just a couple of questions. Your talk tonight focused on two jurisdictions, Canada and the U.S. Are there others that we could take lessons from, for example?
Yes.
And do you have any views on the BioNiche E. coli vaccine that's
Yes.
been in development for quite a few years?
Yes. Other countries. 2008, Ireland received a certificate of excellence in food safety from the European Union for its food safety program, 2008, from the European Union. And Ireland is fairly well established in the food safety arena internationally, and this award indicated their accomplishment. It wasn't 2 months later when there was an outbreak of salmonella in hogs, in pork, that put well over 1,000 people in hospital, and dioxin residues, again in pork because of contaminated animal feed, that took really the bloom off the award. Australia is a country that has probably progressed in the last 10 years more than any of the other countries in the world in terms of its development of food safety programs and foodborne illness surveillance. The data that they're generating in that country are very comprehensive, and Canada could well take lessons from the Australians in terms of the progress that they've been able to make, and their relatively small population size and yet large geographic area. After all of the nasty things I said about Canada, Canada comes out of this ranking rather well when economists take a look at the features that define what is and what is not an excellent food safety system. They look at things like technology that's available. They take a look at transparency. They take a look at legislation. And all combined, when you use those features, Canada ranks fourth in a comparison of 17 OECD countries. The study was done out of the University of Regina. I don't think that the criteria that were used in this assessment were as comprehensive and objective as they should. I think Canada has, in terms of all of the other developed nations, a relatively comprehensive and safe food safety system. I just want you to know that given the shortcomings that exist in the system, the level of safety that we have in Canada is probably more by accident than design. And if you take the case in point of the Irish experience in winning this food safety award from the European Union and then suffering 2 very embarrassing foodborne illness outbreaks caused by a contaminating bacteria and then a highly carcinogenic chemical, it goes to show you just how much vulnerability there is associated with the operation of food safety systems at the level of competence that they are operated nationally and internationally.
2 quick more questions. This gentleman right there.
I have the same question.
Oh, fine. Go ahead. This is on food radiation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Holley. Just 2 quick questions. One, I was curious of how many people in this room have actually eaten irradiated food that they've known. And how
Could we
many
have a show
people?
of hands? How many people have actually eaten irradiated?
No, but excluding spices.
Not
Oh, okay, okay.
And how many
excluding.
would eat it?
God bless you.
Same question in the United States. Twice the audience, 80 people, 80% of the people would have eaten it.
Yeah. The Consumers Association of Canada did a survey they published. It was an Angus Reid poll in February, and their cumulative positions would have shown that 65% of folks would be in that same category. That was out of 1,000 individuals sampled across Canada. So the tide is very definitely changed with respect to attitude, and very clearly that change in attitude toward irradiation is shared by many other developed countries as well, and some of the not so well developed countries like Chile, where consumer support for food irradiation is really quite positive, in the United States as well. And it's unfortunate that the organic people would take positions that exclude the use of irradiation of food products under the organic label. I think they'd well be advised to reconsider their position, particularly since there's an equal chance that the next foodborne illness outbreak involving salmonella could well be an organic food product.
It's my pleasure to thank you again. Rick, please join me. That last answer and indeed many of the questions demonstrate a theme in our course. See, I told you this, that you can't really separate science and policy. Irradiation is as much about policy as it is about science, just as organic is not exactly a science-based notion either. So we're dealing with a scientifically literate consumer where you're having to constantly deal with these kind of problems about science and policy overlap, and that you can't really separate the science. I told you that. Anyway, Rick, thank you very, very much. It's been a good day. He's going to be around. We'll enjoy the reception. Any administrative points you wanted to say? No? Right outside. Enjoy yourself. Thanks a lot for coming.